Fantasy football, RSVP. So let's get right to it. I'm Dean Curry. Get your popcorn ready. The season has started. Let's start off by giving you the basics that you need to win your fantasy football league. Every year I'm giving advice for people to win. Sometimes people follow it, sometimes they don't. But if you follow this advice, you will win your league. Okay? Make sure, first and foremost, whether you had a good draft or a bad draft, make sure you have a balanced team and you have reserves. I know that sounds simple, but so many teams I see are so top heavy at running back and so top heavy at wide receiver, or they have 2 tight ends or 3 tight ends, like some crazy stuff, or 2 kickers. Bottom line is, you can't play all your running backs and you can't play all your wide receivers at once. I could understand maybe having 1 reserve on the bench or possibly 2, but there's no need to have 3 or 4. You need to make trades, okay? And don't fall. The biggest mistake I see people make is they fall in love with their players or they overvalue their players, especially in trades. I mean, I see trades that people put down that are just outright ridiculous. 3 mediocre players for 2 superstars, or 2 mediocre players for 1 superstar. And, nobody's going to go for that. And you actually lose credibility, with the other teams, because they won't take your next trade as serious, even if it's a good trade, because you're always, putting up trades that are really just not going to work. So basically you have to have balance on your team. I prefer having a backup quarterback on my team. I always carry 2. Sometimes it's a bad matchup for a quarterback. Quarterbacks get injured. It's always a good idea to have it. But if you don't have balance on your team, the time to get it is either now or as the season's starting in the next few weeks. Meaning, if one of your bench players that you consistently put on the bench has a big week, that is the time to unload him. Don't think that he's going to keep having these great weeks. If he's on your bench, he's on your bench for a reason. So sometimes, and the other fundamental mistake I see people make is they never look ahead 3 weeks, 4 weeks, 5 weeks, 6 weeks down the road. There's things you could look up like strength of schedule, and you could look ahead 3, 4, 5 weeks. And if you see one of your players going to have really tough, he's a runner, and he's going to have really tough run defenses in the next, from weeks 3 to 8, maybe you should trade him, even though he's a good player. Or, it doesn't hurt. I start looking at the playoff rounds from draft day. I kind of know who I want to pick up at draft because I'm looking at rounds 13 through 17 and I see the bad matchups. And if I have a great wide receiver or a great running back and he's going against 3 out of 4, during the 4 weeks of the playoffs, 3 out of 4, he's going to bet against some of the best corners in the league, I'm not going to want to play that guy. He's going to, be double teamed or triple teamed or whatever. I would rather trade that person away and look for favorable matchups. But, the playoffs is a whole nother discussion. What I want to talk about is looking ahead, like maybe 3, 4, 5 weeks ahead, and making sure you don't have really tough matchups coming up. I mean, I see players, they play their guy, whether it be, Gurley when he was healthy or Barkley or whatever the case may be. Barkley might be the one exception because he catches out of the backfield, but certain running backs, they're just going to play him and wide receivers. They're going to play them every single week. Outside of the top 3, whether it's Kamara, Barkley, or Zeke Elliott, or AB, or, whatever the case may be, at wide receiver, Adams, or whatever the case may be, the bottom line is that, there are wide receivers and running backs that you should sit. Even though they're very good, you should sit and find a more favorable matchup. I mean, it's just about points, and a lot of times I give advice to teams and, they're like, oh, I didn't win this week. And I'm like, don't worry about it. You're building for the playoffs. And your strategy is building for favorable matchups that are coming up in the next weeks. And you have favorable matchups in the playoffs. And a lot of people I give advice to wonder why their record might not be the number one record, or they may not have the best points for. But I'm not even thinking of that. I'm giving advice based on the matchups I'm seeing 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 weeks out. That's why our company is different. We're really analyzing, those matchups in the coming weeks. And then I'm also looking at your playoff schedule. So when you make the playoffs, maybe as the 3rd or 4th, seed, and then you have favorable match. Wow, I was the 3rd or 4th ranked. I barely got in the playoffs, or I was the 3rd or 4th ranked or 5th ranked team, and I just rolled away at the playoffs. I'm like, well, that's no mistake. We were looking at that from the beginning, and the matchups coming up, and that's how you really, have to look at it. And you can't fall in love with your players. If you see a bench player and he has a good week, that is the time to unload him. And if you see someone else's player struggling for a couple of weeks because you saw that he was going to have two hard, he was a running back, and he has 2 hard defenses, coming up, and he has 2 weeks in a row where his numbers are really low, that is the time to pounce on that guy, with the trade, because chances are that guy's not paying attention to the matchups. The only thing he's seen, he's busy with his life, he's seen is that, his running back is underperforming. And adversely, you might see that he has favorable matchups coming up. And you got to think, matchups and things like that. I mean, there's a difference between winning and losing, and, trading is the same thing. You have to start thinking about matchups. Look at those weeks in the playoffs, 13 through 17, make sure. And even the last couple of weeks of the season, look at those, because you might need a win or two in those last couple of weeks to get into the, playoffs. So you have to start thinking about strength of schedule. You could look it up, strength of schedule, and, look for the teams that also have the favorable, matchups. Strength of schedule against the run, strength of schedule against the pass. You have to look at these numbers. There's a reason why the people I give advice to continually win. I'm looking ahead weeks and weeks in advance. I'm looking at matchups coming in weeks and weeks in advance. That's why we do things so differently here at our company, okay, is we're really strategizing and building for the playoffs. And, that starts in the draft, before the draft, And, people think I'm just, telling people to pick up these players, because they're good players. And I'm like, no, you're picking up these players because they have one of the easiest schedules, or they have one of the easiest schedules against the run, and they have a pretty good runner. Or you're picking up this player because, this team is going to be going against really hard teams, and their team is not very good. So they're going to abandon the run in almost every single game and just air it out, like I was telling people about Tampa Bay last year and other teams like that. They're just going to air it out all the time because they're going to be down by 3 or 4 touchdowns. Adversely, a team might have a really good running back, and they may just be a really solid team. They're going to be up by 3 or 4 touchdowns, so they're not going to pass it as much, and they're going to grind the clock out with their running back. And that's something we saw with the Rams last year, because they were so far ahead in so many games that they, the Saints or another team, where teams are just going to load up on running and try to kill the clock. So these are the basics of fantasy football RSVP. Subscribe to the channel. Listen to the podcast. You will win your league guaranteed. Okay, I'm Dean Curry, Fantasy Football, RSVP.com. Have a wonderful day and an even better tomorrow.